you could feel the anxiety and tension that these men were feeling. They were becoming aware of the fact that they were going home. And for many of them, they were going home a lot different than when they left. And they would ask me questions. This is going to be hard for me. Tell me, Lieutenant, could you love a man that's blind? And of course, you know the guy who was asking was. Could you love a man who doesn't have legs? And the one asking didn't have legs. They haunt me.
I'm Steve Simon, host of the Heritage Minute video and podcast series. We are honored to present this story related to Operation Homecoming, the 1973 return of American prisoners of war from Vietnam, a group that included 33 graduates of the United States Air Force Academy. Then Lieutenant Penny Morse, now Major retired Penny Grossman, was a nurse stationed at Clark Air Base in the Philippines, the first stop for many of the returning warriors, some of whom were in her care. This is Penny's first-hand account of that experience, events she has not talked about with anyone outside her family in 50 years. Helping to tell her story is George Hayward, author of The Party Dolls, a book about the experiences of Vietnam POWs held captive in the years preceding Operation Homecoming. And now, George Hayward and Penny Grossman.
I'm George Hayward, author of The Party Dolls, the true tragic story of two Americans' attempted escape from a 1969 Hanoi POW camp. And I am your guest host of this special edition of the Heritage Minute podcast. First, I'd like to thank the Air Force Academy Association and Foundation and the Long Blue Line Podcast Network for letting me host this episode. I'd like to share with you the memories of the Vietnam War from a beloved friend. Penny Grossman served 21 years of active duty as an Air Force nurse, including at the Air Force Academy, retiring in 1989 out of Peterson Air Force Base. Her first assignment was Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska, where she treated many wounded American servicemen who were on their way home after being medevaced out of Vietnam. A few years later, in 1973, she was stationed at Clark Air Base in the Philippines during Operation Homecoming, when nearly 600 American prisoners of war were freed. The first leg of their journey home took them from Hanoi to Clark, where Penny witnessed their first steps of freedom. I've known Penny for some 20 years, and her husband Barry, also retired Air Force, for more than 30 years. But I'd never heard any of this until just a few months ago. Her stories moved me to tears, and she shed some tears in the telling. A short time later, she recorded those memories on audio, which I'm going to share with you today. First, let's meet Penny.
Well, my father was in the Air Force, joined right after Pearl Harbor, retired out of Dyess Air Force Base, was there for my swearing in. I think he was pretty proud. It looked like his buttons were popping off his shirt. In fact, I have a funny little story about that. I actually wanted to join the Navy because I thought the uniforms were cuter. And my father said, absolutely not. If you're going to join any branch of the military, it has to be the Air Force so you can keep up the family tradition. And I said, what tradition are you talking about? Grandpa, his father was a Marine. And he said, the one I'm starting. So I obviously joined in 1968 and retired in 1989. Very memorable because I met and married my husband while I was in the Air Force. had our one and only son while I was on active duty. So to say it's been a huge chunk of my life is an understatement.
When Penny entered active duty, she admits to having something of a blind spot to the cultural turmoil dividing our nation over the Vietnam War.
Well, I think it was at a time when there were a lot of not pro-military which sentiment in our country. You have to realize that back in those days, nurses volunteered. We weren't drafted, but there was a lot of people drafted in the military who, had it not been for the draft, would have never been there, and truthfully didn't want to be there, but they were. And I know from having talked to guys after I came back, I was kind of in a bubble, I think, regarding a lot of the sentiment that was going on in our country. Even though I had been active duty, I was active duty, and my first assignment was in Elmendorf in Alaska. There was no cable TV. We watched Christmas specials after New Year's. It came up on reels that they would rerun. So that was kind of insulated. In nursing school, I was really in a bubble. I ate, drank, breathed, lived nursing. The nurses' quarters were in the hospital. You ate in the hospital. I didn't watch news. I didn't read newspapers. I was too busy being a student.
It wasn't until Penny took a one-year break in service and worked at a VA hospital in New Hampshire, where she cared for World War II veterans, that she began to learn about anti-war protests and movements and how terribly many Vietnam veterans were being treated by their fellow Americans upon their return stateside.
It was hurtful because my very first experience taking care of the injured from Vietnam was in Alaska, before I ever went to Clark, before there were ever any prisoners released. There's a point in the Pacific Ocean where you're closer to Alaska than you are the mainland. And when casualties, after being staged in Japan, were being airvac'd to the United States, if there was something happen on board where they felt they needed to divert, and they were at that point in the Pacific, they came to Elmendorf. And we had an entire floor devoted to what we called RONs, the rest overnights. When they offloaded those patients, the crews would go rest for 12 hours, and we would take care of the patients that had been on the aircraft. Medications were given on Zulu time so that everything would be kept the same. They started Zulu time before they left Japan. And I was a 23-year-old second lieutenant. I was the same age as many of the men that I had to take care of when I was on RON duty. We would have 12-hour shifts, and nurses in the hospital would have that built into their schedule. And if an aircraft came and it was the day you were scheduled, then you would be with them for that 12-hour period. And that was the most difficult for me. You could feel the anxiety and tension that these men were feeling. They were suddenly becoming, in my mind, again without asking, they were becoming aware of the fact that they were going home. And for many of them, they were going home a lot different than when they left. And they would ask me questions. This is going to be hard for me. Tell me, Lieutenant, could you love a man that's blind? And of course, the guy who was asking was, could you love a man who doesn't have legs? And the one asking didn't have legs. They haunt me. So, yeah, how did I feel about the people protesting? That was hard. I'm a patriot.
When Penny returned to active duty, she landed at Clark Air Base, and in February 1973, Operation Homecoming began.
I remember the very first group that came. It's burned in my memory. Because I was charge nurse of the newborn nursery, I was not pulled to take care of the returnees per se. That operation started, about 3 weeks before the first returnee got to Clark. In preparation, they had to reconfigure an actual ward, as it was, for them. Security was unbelievable, and the hospital referred to it as Operation Egress. And we all had lanyards with a number on it and had to line up to just get into the hospital. And then within the hospital, there were stairwell monitors and elevator monitors. And a number on your badge indicated how far you could go in the hospital. So I was never permitted to go to the actual ward where they were located. So because over half of my staff was pulled in order to take care of them, I was working that day. And we had a lounge area in the newborn nursery, and this was pre-rooming in, where babies would go and stay with their moms all day and all night. So I had the moms come down to that lounge area, and I brought all their babies in, and they were televising this happening on AFN, on the TV that was in there. So I got to watch in the lounge area on the TV while they were getting off of the aircraft before getting on the bus. Now, I should back up a little bit and say all of the moms were there except for one mom that had just had a C-section. So I'm holding that baby while all the other moms are with theirs. And as soon as they made the turn at the front of the hospital to get to the emergency room kind of loading dock area, it just so happened that the newborn nursery was in that area on an upper floor. And in the nursery, they had windows that opened as a doorway. And myself and this baby were out on that rooftop, both crying. Not sad, just so happy that they were coming back. We were told not to go out to the flight line for reasons unknown to me. I know why the security was so tight. They were afraid that something might be said that would get out as general knowledge that could jeopardize the other returnees being released. And so we were cautioned, we were told not to speak to the press. It almost felt like a top secret kind of environment. So I don't know if it was for those same reasons that they didn't want people to go to the flight line when the planes landed. But let me tell you, we were there in force. No matter what time of the day or night that they returned, everybody was standing at the bench yelling, "Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back." There was once that I volunteered to go on the bus on my day off. And that was the hardest for me because you may remember watching on TV stateside a bus backing into the clamshell of the aircraft. And then they had returnees coming down the steps and being interviewed that would then go over onto the bus. But what the general public didn't see were the patients that were being, or the prisoners that were being offloaded that could not walk off the aircraft. Some were even on litters. And there was an odor on that bus, in spite of them being clean-shaven and new clothes. It was, I know what was the stench of their environment, and it just permeated their entire being, in spite of being clean-shaven and showered and haircuts and new clothes.
Not all of the American POWs were released at once during Operation Homecoming. They were freed in groups beginning February 12, 1973, with the last group leaving Vietnam on April 4th of that year. Except for the most seriously injured, the Americans were released by date of shoot-down. The longest-held prisoners were released first, and they were the ones who had suffered the most torture and lived in the most brutal and squalid conditions for as many as 8 years. For example, during the events of my book, at a prison they called the Annex, the Americans were living 9 men in a poorly ventilated cell about 20 by 18 feet. Their toilets were 3 buckets by the door. No privacy. They got emptied once a day. Try to imagine the stench in that cell, especially in summer when the room just sweltered.
It becomes a part of your fiber. I mean, it's your environment, and that was the odor. And that leads me to a little story about the first day also. I had worked my 12-hour shift and just got back to the house when the phone rang, and it was a supervisor. And she said to me, "Penny, you're never going to believe what these guys want." She said, more than anything, right now, they want bubble baths. And of course, the hospital didn't have bubble baths. And she said, "Can you help?" So I went door to door in base housing, soliciting bubble bath, and ended up with Mr. Bubbles, Revlon's mink pearl bubbles, and took bags and bags of it back to the hospital so these guys could get their bubble baths. Another interesting thing was powers to be in the hospital thought, well, these guys haven't had a decent diet in who knows how long, and so their systems are probably not prepared for a routine, everyday, what you and I eat diet. So we're going to start them out on clear liquids. We'll do broth and Jell-O and toast, and of course there was complete anarchy. They said, "Don't think so. Give me steak, give me eggs, and that was only the first group that had to go through the broth and Jell-O. They found out that these guys handled it quite okay, and all of the groups that came back after that didn't have to go through the clear liquid diet, as it were.
I've heard stories about their first meals at Clark. I think most of the POWs, especially the longer-held ones, remember that first meal at Clark very well. There's a great story about one American, I think it was Red McDaniel, who came into the chow hall for the first time and asked for a dozen eggs. The staff refused, a ruckus ensued, and a compromise was struck. He got half a dozen eggs. He took them to his table, sat down, scarfed them down, and then promptly walked back into line to get his other half dozen. I've had the privilege to speak to many Vietnam POWs over the years, and to call a few genuine friends. And Penny's story about the bubble bath really struck me. It was something I could totally see happening. One of the things that I've always respected about those men, that I think almost anyone can learn from, is their appreciation for the little things, the little pleasures, the little joys, the little freedoms that our society and our nation afford us. Like bubble bath for a man who hasn't had a bath in years. Still, Operation Homecoming was, surprisingly, not a joyous event at Clark.
I think they were kind of still trying to wrap their minds around the fact of really what was happening. And I think, I don't know because I didn't ask, but my sense is that, first of all, not everybody had been released. And I'm sure there were deep thoughts about those that still had to go through, hopefully, that process, and that nothing would happen to change that. This is all speculation on my part. And just the enormity of now heading home and it being a reality, I think was just almost more than you could comprehend. It was, in taking everything in, I just remember that there wasn't cheering and there wasn't yelling and there wasn't clapping. It was quiet. It was quiet on that bus.
When Penny first told me these stories over coffee, it was emotional and her patriotism shone through.
These are things that I haven't reflected on in 50 years. And I realize today, more than I did then, how life-changing that whole experience was for me. Without consciously putting words to it, it made me proud to have been a member of the military. It made me proud to serve. And it made me so much more aware of how special and wonderful freedom is. And I believe God put me there so that I could appreciate that. It was life-changing, truly life-changing. And I said to Barry, aside from marrying him and having our son, that experience ranks in the top 5 most memorable experiences of my life.
There is something about spending time with a Vietnam POW that is life-changing. I first learned about the ordeals of Vietnam POWs and the failed escape attempt I wrote about in the Party Dolls from my first boss in Air Force Public Affairs, Bill Baugh. He was a retired colonel, an F-4 pilot who spent 6 years in North Vietnamese prisons, and when I worked for him, one of his favorite sayings was, "There's no such thing as a bad day." He often said it when I was whining about something trivially important in my 20-something-year-old mind, but he lived that credo. He exuded a patriotism and a joy for life that I once wrote was contagious. It's clear that Penny Grossman caught the same bug from her own Vietnam War experiences and from the POWs she saw get their first tastes of freedom.
I can't stand for the national anthem without tears rolling down my cheeks. Every single steel box that comes back to the United States that's a casualty of war is draped in that flag. When I was at Clark, I went on a little space available trip and did Hong Kong and I did Bangkok, Hong Kong, and Thailand. And coming back on the hop, we diverted to Tan Son Nhut in Vietnam. Because when we landed, a captain came on board and said, we have to accomplish this really fast because we've been under fire all day. And the reason that we stopped was because we were taking on steel boxes. So it's had a profound effect on how I feel about my country. How I care about the men and women who serve even today. Still the best country in the world. In spite of all our current problems, there isn't anywhere else I want to live.
What does Penny want you to take away from her experiences?
To never forget the sacrifices that are made. Stop and just think for a moment. It's hard for me to imagine that there's anybody on planet Earth that doesn't have a relative, a friend, somebody that they know that has given this service to their country. Remember now, we're not in a draft situation anymore. People that are in the military are there willingly. And I wouldn't have traded 1 second of my life and my decision to have joined the military and been there 20 years. It has enriched and blessed my life on so many levels we don't have enough time to talk about them. But for those who haven't, and we're in a military town here, please realize what these folks are doing for you. We have a little Army family that we adopted. They have since moved away, but her husband did 3 tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. 3 tours in a 20-year career, and saw unspeakable things. Our world is not at peace and rest. And there are people out there ready to be on the front lines. Don't forget it. Appreciate it. And you know what? When somebody's playing the national anthem, if you're not going to put your hand over your heart or salute it, at least be quiet. Show some respect.
Operation Homecoming would continue until the last flight out of Hanoi on April 4th, 1973. I hope you'll take a moment to reflect on what those men endured, their resilience and their heroism, and if you get the chance, listen to one of them speak. A deep thank you to Penny Grossman for sharing her story after 5 decades, for her patriotism, and for making me misty. I expect that she missed it a few of you too. Thank you again to the Air Force Academy Association and Foundation, Heritage Minute host Steve Simon, and the entire Long Blue Line Podcast Network team for having me. I'm author George Hayward. Thank you very much for listening.